So in my house growing up, and I don't know about your house, but in my house, we always had a Sears catalog. Can I see the hands, everyone who had a Sears? Oh, wow, good. I thought I was alone here. And Sears catalog, this was back in the 70s that we had this, and it's this giant catalog, like 4 inches thick with 300 pages. It had everything in there that your heart could ever want or desire. Actually, it was like the internet of the 70s, of our day. You know, you could flip through that and find anything. The thing is, when I was just 6 years old, a lot of you know that my family moved to Liberia, to the world's thickest rainforest, and we lived on a mission station where there was no running water, no roads, no electricity, no flushing toilets. We boiled water out back to drink, but somehow the Sears catalog made it to Liberia in the bush. There was no mailman or mail service, so it was just there to tease you. And I remember sitting in the dark with a kerosene lantern, looking through the pages of it, just dreaming of life back in America. And I always landed on the same page, and I would stick on this page here. I found it on the internet, and it's the superhero page. And I knew I needed one of these costumes. $5.92, it seemed like a lot, but you know, if we could pull that together, I could fly just like Superman. I really wanted the Superman costume. I'm not lying to you, more than anything else. And I think deep on the inside, think about your life or your kids, but every kid wants to be a superhero because superheroes are this. Superhero is a story of an ordinary person, just a regular person who can be changed and transformed into this supernatural person that can do, you know, supernatural, superhuman things. Everybody wants to do that. But that's the story of an ordinary person doing these superhuman things. For example, you have, let me see if you know a few of these. We have an engineer. His name is Bruce Wayne, and he becomes Batman. Thank you over here. You've got a high school teenager by the name of Peter Parker, and he becomes Spider-Man. Everyone's got that one. And then you have a museum curator by the name of Diana Prince, and she becomes Wonder Woman. And then, of course, you have Clark Kent. He's just a newspaper reporter with horn-rimmed glasses and a necktie and a briefcase, and he turns into Superman. All right. And the thing is, let's be honest, it's not just kids that want to be superheroes. I think even adults want to be superheroes. We all sit at our desk and you see Clark Kent with the glasses and the briefcase and you go, I can be him. I can do superhuman things. I just need the chance. I think that's why Comic-Con is filled with so many 38-year-olds, you know, these grown men and grown women that go to Comic-Con because they think they can, and they go in costume. In the 90s, when I started raising my sons, Superman was a has-been. And who they loved were these characters from Japan. There's some Japanese TV filmmakers started making this story about teenagers that would transform into superheroes. And it was just poorly done on a low budget. Then they dubbed it into English and they started to play it, badly dubbed into English, play it on TV here in America. And my kids all wanted to be a Mighty Morphin Power Ranger. And so we started to buy them Mighty Morphin Power Ranger suits. Here's one of them here. And there he is. And they would cross their arms and say this, because in the show they would do this, it's morphing time. That's what they would say. And the story is just ordinary high school teenagers say it's morphing time. Then they become these superheroes that pursue justice and do really good and beautiful things. And here's what I don't think that the Japanese scriptwriters knew when they were writing this TV show. I don't think they knew they were using a Greek word when they use the word morph, that it's morphin time, or the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. Morph is from the Greek metamorpho. And in our Bibles, for example, Paul, many times writing, he uses the word metamorpho, the same one they're using in Japan. And often, usually, in our Bibles, it's translated as a word transformed, to be changed. Metamorpho is where we get our word metamorphosis, but really it's the best word in English is to be transformed. And the truth is, every human being, we long to be changed. We long for transformation. And spiritual formation is about the process of being transformed. The problem is, there is the person you are over here today, and there's the person here who you want to become, and in the middle is a gap, is a disparity, is a hole. And the question is, how do we close the difference? How do we go from the person that we are right now to the person who we know that God has made us to be? That's what spiritual formation is all about. And the problem is, I don't think most Christians even think it's possible, but Paul and Jesus, for example, keep telling us that it is. So open your Bibles to Colossians chapter 3, and I want to start here. Paul has one whole chapter dedicated to this idea. I'm going to read the first 10 verses. Since you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, underline that, we're going to come back to it, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. Verse 5, put to death, something has to die. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Verse 7, you used to walk in these ways. It's the life you once lived. That's good. Underline that. But now you must rid yourself of all of these things: anger, malice, rage, slander, filthy language. Move them from your lips. Do not lie to each other, since you have taken off the old self with its practices and put on the new self, which is being remade in knowledge in the image of its creator. Those are very powerful thoughts that Paul is changing about the old person, the old self, and you become this new person in Christ. So as we begin this series, we started last week by talking about that the goal of spiritual formation is what? To become like Christ. And then this week, as we try to start by understanding what spiritual formation is, I want to talk about, well, to become like Christ requires one big thing. It requires change. Spiritual formation is about the process of being changed to become more and more like Jesus Christ. So today I want to talk about transformation and how that happens. I have this key thought on the screen, and it's this: spiritual maturity, correctly understood, means a changed life. God offers you the possibility of being transformed into the good and beautiful and thriving person that he made you to be. And the truth is, we all hope for change. I think we all believe, and it's really when we look at our future, we only believe it's possible because we think things can change. We all hope, our hope for the future is based on that something can change. We hope that our circumstances will change. We hope that a person, a friend will change, or someone that we love will change. We hope that an addiction or a habit that we're fighting will change. We hope that a relationship will change. We hope that ourselves, I, me, you, will change. They say, counselors say this, that in a relationship, if one of the two in the relationship start to believe that the other person will never change, can't change, they give up. It turns toxic. But the possibility of change is really the essence of hope. And if you think about your own life, we all live with this kind of hope that things can change. That's why at New Year's, we make resolutions. At New Year's, we join fitness works and things like that. You don't go after January. You're not there in February, March, but you tried. You made an attempt. We all hope to change. But this hope for change is why we go to recovery groups. It's why we go to rehab. It's why we go to counselors and sit through therapy. It's why we go to motivational seminars and read books. But now we all have this hope for change. Now, in Christ, God offers us the best change possible. There's two verses I want to point out as we start. 2 Corinthians 3:18, you are being transformed into his image. That's a very powerful line. Romans chapter 12, verse 2, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed. And in both of these, Paul uses this word transformed, which we talked about a minute ago, comes from the Greek metamorpho, which means metamorphosis in English, or we get the word transformed. Going back on your days in school, everybody at some point learns about metamorphosis, right? And it's always around the butterfly. And the butterfly, of all things in life, we know goes through metamorphosis. And maybe as we use this phrase today, you're not sure what the butterfly does. So this is just a refresher. I brought some scientific literature with me to help you understand. And here's how it happens. So you have a caterpillar, and the caterpillar emerges and starts to crawl. Obviously, this caterpillar's in Arizona. There's not a blade of grass, and the sun is burning down on his head. And he's hungry. So a caterpillar starts looking for food. He finds cake, ice cream, a pickle of all things, some cheese, sausage. What else does he have? Pie, pizza. No, that's a watermelon, a muffin, some candy. And then we end up with a really fat, satisfied caterpillar. So butterflies start as caterpillars. Okay, that's the first thing. And then when they're fat and satisfied, they climb up into a bush or a tree, and they form what's called a chrysalis or a cocoon with moss. But it's a chrysalis or a cocoon or a pupa. And then they go into this cocoon for sometimes just 7 or 14 days. With some caterpillars, it's a month or months, some even over a year. And then they climb out. They crawl out of a small hole, and their wings fill with life, and they start to fly. And I share this because the butterfly story is a lot like your story. There's this change that happens in your life, that happens in our life, that turns us into the person that God made us to be, this metamorphosis that can happen in all of our lives. People who write about and talk about change, they say it often happens in 3 stages, and I want to share those stages with you. The first stage of any kind of change or transformation, it starts with this. It starts by allowing something to die. And that's what Paul says. So go back to our text, and I want to read a few lines from it because he says it in several different ways. He says in verse 3, "For you have died, and now your life is in Christ." Verse 5, he says, "Put to death what belonged to your earthly nature." Verse 7, he says, "You used to walk in these ways." He says, "This is the life you used to live." In other words, let it die. But now you must rid yourself of these things. Verse 9, he says, "Take off your old self." So do you hear what Paul is describing? He's saying that there is an old you, that there's this separation from the past that needs to happen, and you need to let it die. When you look at your own life and think about your own life, my guess is there's some things, there's some people that maybe it's time for you to let die. Maybe there's a relationship that you have no business being a part of. Then I want to say this morning, let it die. Maybe there's a habit that you've been struggling with, and this habit is slowly turning into an addiction. Can I say it's time to let it die? Maybe there's a friendship that just hasn't been healthy for you. I want to say let it die. Maybe there's something that you tried to accomplish in the past and you keep going back to your failure. Maybe it's time to move on and let it die. Maybe somebody hurt you deeply with their words or their actions and you just can't forgive them. So you carry around and harbor all of this bitterness and resentment, but that resentment is destroying your own soul. So I want to say, let it die. We all have those things that, as Paul uses to use his language, says it needs to die. The trouble is we can breathe life back into these things sometimes when we should just let them die. A good friend of mine, Scott Erickson, he's a painter. He goes by Scott the Painter, and he was here at Easter painting in all our services. And Scott he's written a book on prayer, and he writes a lot. And I wanted to share with you something he wrote recently. He writes, "I very much have gone through a season, still there, in which I have had to lay down many aspects of my life. It's been painful and mournful, a lot of feeling lost and not sure where to go next. But in all the vagueness, I keep hearing this phrase, let it die, so it can rise. For me, it's God saying, my resurrection is on the other side of this. But you can't get there without death. It has to die first before I can resurrect it. My joy will be there. Just lay it down and let it die." And maybe that's what you've been doing. You've been holding on to things, holding on to people that it's time to let them go, let it die. When when Scott wrote this, he was doing a series of paintings on letting things die. And I started to see all of his paintings had things shot with arrows. I brought one to show you. He's got a crow upside down and dead with arrows in it. And he paints, let it die. And the thing is, maybe you've been carrying around dead crows in your soul, but there are things like that that need an arrow stuck in them, like this crow. I don't know. I don't really like crows, so this one doesn't really grab my heart, but I resonate with it. Because maybe you have things like that, and it's time to let it die. The early Christians were so convinced that when Jesus died on the cross, that their old self went with him. They were not who they used to be. They were so convinced that their old self died with him, they used this language. They said, the old man, or they would say, the old woman is dead, is gone. And that's how Paul writes it. And sometimes people try to bring it back up. And I want to say, don't let them bring back the old you or the things that you're trying to let die. We all have these seasons in our lives where you go from one stage of life to another. For example, where you get to start again. Maybe you start a new job, and so you're able to grow a new reputation, or you move into a new neighborhood, and so you make new friends, or you move to another state, another city, and you get to start again. I had one of those opportunities to start again and to let the past die when I graduated from college. So right after college, just a few weeks after graduating, I got my first job as a youth pastor in La Mirada, California. And I was busting it. I didn't know what I was doing. I was scared spitless, but I was just trying to be the best youth pastor ever. And then I go to one of our first board meetings, and one of the board members comes up to me before the meeting. He said, hey, Palmer, he said, I just ran into a Biola student this last week. That's where I graduated from. And he said, so I asked them if they knew you. And he said, I got the strangest response. And I said, oh, really? He said, I said, hey, so do you know Palmer Chinchen? We just hired him. And the person said, oh, Palmer Chinchen, you didn't hire him as a youth pastor. And they said, yes, we hired him as a youth pastor. And he said, this person said, that's impossible. Palmer Chinchen could never be a youth pastor. And you must be thinking of someone else. And so this man says to me, why would they say that about you? And I just said, I have no idea. I don't have the slightest clue. I knew exactly what he was talking about. I knew exactly. Because my twin brother and I had the worst reputation at Biola because every intramural team we signed up for, we started riots with the other team. Whether it was flag football, basketball, we even got ejected from a softball game. How do you get ejected from a softball game? I don't know, but we started a fight. We're starting fights everywhere. We were the notorious Chinchen friends. We weren't our twins. We weren't very big, but there were two of us. And just had bad attitudes, horrible. But that was the old self. And this guy's trying to bring it back. I'm going, no, that's not me anymore. I'm a youth pastor now. I'm trying to change. I'm trying to be the new Palmer. And people will do that to you. They will try to identify you by your past. And I want to remind you today, no, Jesus makes you a new creation. So let it die. Let the past go behind you. Sometimes this old thing will raise its ugly head and act like it still has life. Don't give it space to breathe. Let it die. Okay, so we're talking about stages, phases of change. The second one I want to show you is what I'm calling today, I haven't heard anyone else use this language, is the in-between days. These are the days between when you've decided to let it die, but you're still in the process of becoming more and more like Christ. It's kind of like with a caterpillar that crawls into the cocoon. Once it's in that cocoon, massive changes are happening. But it can be there, like I said, for days or months or even over a year. Spiritual formation writers and thinkers talk about spiritual formation like this. They say it's a journey. 100 years ago, Pilgrim's Progress was written. It's a very difficult journey. It's not an easy one. It doesn't happen immediately. And the Bible always, in Bible stories where we see someone letting something die and moving on to something new, there's always this stage of the in-between days. For example, Jonah tries to kill himself jumping out of a boat. He gets swallowed by a whale, and he's there for 3 days before Nineveh lives. That was his days in between. I think of Joseph. Joseph, his brothers tried to kill him at first, put him in a pit. Do you know where he ends up after he's in the pit? We often talk about him becoming a leader in Egypt, but we forget that for 13 years after the pit incident, he's a slave for 13 years. Those were his days in between. The nation of Israel, they leave Egypt. They're letting it die behind them, but before they get to the promised land, this new life, they have 40 years of days in between. Even Jesus had his in-between days. For example, we all know that he's crucified on Friday, and we talk a lot about Friday. And then on Sunday, 3 days later, we talk about him rising from the dead in his new life, and that's on Sunday. But there's a day in between, isn't there? There's Saturday. There's Friday. We know a lot about Friday. We know a lot about Saturday. Some call it Silent Saturday. We don't talk much about Saturday, but Jesus had his own day in the cave. I think most of life in many ways is like Saturday, isn't it? It's the day between death and life. Saturday, if you think about it, though, is a really good day because it's Saturday. I mean, it might be a tough day, but it's a good day because it's the day after. It's the day after you told them no. It's the day after you decided to change. It's the day after you decided to take this big step of faith and ask God to do something new. It's the day after you quit the addiction or said no to the habit. Saturday is a day of enduring and persevering and pushing, and it's not easy. It's really tough. When I say that, I think about the butterfly process. If you know much about the cocoon or the chrysalis, you know that eventually the butterfly will bore a hole in it, create a crack, and then it will force its body through there. Now, the thing is, it takes it a while, and it's a really hard process. And sometimes people come along and they see this butterfly struggling to get out of the cocoon, and they'll pull it open or cut it open. And people who know the right thing to say, no, leave it alone. It has to struggle through the hole because in the struggle, through this tiny crack, it's pushing the fluid from its body into its wings. And if you were just to tear the cocoon open and set the butterfly on the table, it would never fly. But forcing its way, the struggle to get through the crack forces the fluid from its body and the blood into its wings, and then it can fly. It's just the same way for us, I think. That real change requires a struggle. It's not easy. It doesn't happen overnight, but it's possible. I have these thoughts about change in our lives because what I'm talking about in this series and even today is not just something that we think about, but it requires real, tangible action on your part. First of all, I think there are practices that you need to stop, that it's time for them to end, let them die. But then there are new practices that you need to begin. That's the whole second half of this series. There are some people that you shouldn't spend another day with. And then there are some people that you need to spend more time with. Let them pour into your life. There are some places that as a follower of Jesus Christ, you have no business going, but there are some places you need to spend more time. There are some passions you need to walk away from and let them die. There are some passions you need to take on. Do you know that it's a well-known fact that the people you spend time with, the places you spend time, they shape who you become. You become like your friends. I've watched it happen. Going back to college, my freshman year, we had a guy from Minnesota move onto our floor across the hall from me and Gary Bradley, who's here at the Grove. And his name was Jim Ewing. We called him Jim Cowboy Ewing, or just Cowboy for short, because he came from rural Minnesota, and he shows up in a Stetson hat and like a plaid shirt, a big giant belt buckle, boots, and Wrangler jeans. And we'd say, like, where's your rope? You know, where's your horse? And he wore that stuff to class every day. We're in Southern California. This was a strange thing. It's like Eloy or something. I don't know where this happens. Anyway, so this is all first semester. We're just busting on him. Second semester, after spending time with a bunch of people in Southern California, do you know what he's wearing second semester? Members-only jackets, terry cloth shirts. He's wearing these Sperry topsiders, like teal-colored. And then he gets himself a pair of MC Hammer parachute pants. And it all changed. because he was tired of being the only cowboy in California, I think. But it's true with all of us. The people you spend time with, the places you go, they shape us and change us, either for the worst or for the better. Now, here's the third stage that I want to talk about and end with this morning, is that Paul says you can become brand new. I want to first read what he says to the church in Corinth, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17. He writes, if anyone is in Christ, they are a new creation. That's you. And old things have passed away, and behold, all things are made new. In Colossians 3, Paul says, you have been raised with Christ. You are this new person. Jesus used to talk about our lives like this. He says, you have died, but you can be born again. Maybe today as we talk about this, you're realizing I've been crawling for too long. I've been stuck in a cage like a cocoon for too long. And Paul says you have this brand new life that Christ wants you to live. I love the way he says it in Ephesians chapter 4. Paul writes, so get rid of your old self, which made you live as you used to. Verse 23, your hearts and minds must be made completely new. And you must put on the new self, which is created in God's likeness and reveals itself in this true life that is upright and holy. That's who you are. Maybe you've never thought of yourself as holy, but Paul keeps saying, no, as this new person, you are holy. You can be that spiritual person, not somebody else but you. I love how he ends this section in Colossians 3. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy, he says it again, and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, bear with each other, forgive. And then he says, and over all these virtues, put on love. That's you. That's the new you. You used to be somebody else, but now you're God's person of compassion and love and gentleness and kindness and building people up. And that kind of life spreads when you live that way. Let me end with one last butterfly illustration. It's about 3 or 4 years ago, we started talking about how this idea kind of represents who the Grove is. And the story is, Andy Andrews writes it in his book. It's about a man by the name of Edward Lorenz. Edward Lorenz is 1963. In 1963, he was a mathematician and also an expert in chaos theory. I hope one day I can be an expert in chaos theory. I'm hoping for that. Anyway, so he is. And then he starts to write about this theory that he has on chaos. And he puts it in a paper, and then he presents it at the New York Academy of Science. And he presents this paper, and when he presents it, he explains that in his opinion, as he studied chaos theory, he believes that, for example, if a butterfly flaps its wings, that it puts molecules of air in motion, and everyone agrees with that. But then his theory went on to explain that when those molecules of air are put into motion, they put more molecules of air into motion, which in turn can put additional molecules of air into even larger motion, and then more wind starts to swirl until, Lorenz says, on the other side of the globe, you have a hurricane. And he called it the butterfly effect. Well, when he presented this at the New York Academy of Science, they mocked him. The scientists ridiculed him. They said, that's preposterous. That's impossible. But it was fascinating. So people wouldn't stop talking about it. It just went to urban legend. Nobody thought it was actually real, but it was intriguing. But then in the mid-1980s, university physicists started to study his theory and extrapolate on his math. And do you know what they found? They found and discovered that Lorenz was right. And they discovered that it wasn't just a theory. It's not that it just could happen. They found that it actually was happening. It was happening so clearly that they gave his idea the status of a law of physics. Let me read. It's called the law of sensitive dependence upon initial conditions. Most of you knew this already, but I didn't. Anyway, the law of sensitive dependence upon initial conditions. But here's where it gets even better. They said this law is not just true with butterflies flapping their wings. They said this law is true in the first movement of any kind, even among people, even in your life. And I say that, I share that this morning to remind you that with every movement that you make, with every conversation that you have, with every act of love or compassion that you show, you have started the molecules of air moving, because by your one life, another life is affected. And then they affect more lives until on the other side of the world, lives are being changed because of what you're doing right here in Tempe or Chandler or Gilbert or Queen Creek. And it's not just, I think this can happen. I'm saying it this morning because I know it's happening. I'm watching it. I've gotten to watch it happen here at the Grove. In fact, it just happened over the last 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago, we stood here and we said, we need to finish a dorm way across on the other side of the Gulf of Mexico. We need to finish a dorm in Haiti, and we need $10,000. And then last week I said, wow, it was phenomenal. Instead of $10,000, a lot of you gave $54,000. Do you know I was wrong last week? It's now $65,000. We can applaud that. And here's the thing. Some of you thought, well, I'm just buying one $50 mattress, or I'm just buying one $200 bunk bed, or I'm just paying for one $200 window. But no, maybe you just gave $10, or it was $50, or the $1,000. But then collectively, something started to happen, and your giving empowered a team of young adults that was standing here 2 weeks ago, about 16 from our Reconcile ministry, who, because of what you're doing here at the Grove, they flew on American Airlines. Okay, so they flew on American, not like a butterfly, but anyway, flew thousands of miles to Haiti, where they put in windows, built bunk beds, and you know what my favorite part is? They painted the girls' dorm pink. Can it get any better than that, than to paint a girls' dorm pink? Now, there's going to be some guys living there for a while. By the way, what is left over in addition to what was given here, we're going to now put a roof on their cafeteria, classroom buildings, and put the walls up. But I say all this because I want you to see that God has created something new in you. You are a new creation. You are not who you used to be. Maybe all of those struggles that you've had before, they're in the past, and He has so much more for you to do with your life that is good and beautiful and will change this world, literally.